Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to the 5th Oxford University Press History Book Club meeting. My name is Susan Ferber, and I'm one of the history editors of OUP. On behalf of my colleagues, thank you so much for taking time to join us today. For those of you who were at our previous book club meetings featuring Thomas Holt's The Movement, Kevin Weddell's The Complete Victory, Annalise Heise's Mahjong, or Phoebe Young's Camping Grounds, welcome back. If you didn't get to see these live, you're lucky. You can still watch the recordings on OUP's YouTube channel. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, and I apologize for those of you who have already heard this, here's a little background. Reading and talking about books in a group has a long tradition. In the late 18th and early 19th century, the first secular American reading circles or conversations, a precursor to book clubs, were begun by women. They required little more than a thirst for literature and a desire to discuss it with like-minded individuals, to talk about challenging ideas, to learn together, and hopefully to have some fun along the way. That's the spirit in which this book club was founded. While we lack an intimacy of a small group in a living room or a coffee shop, I hope we can gain in creating a broad community of readers. This book club will give you the chance to directly interact with authors, as well as an opportunity to continue the conversation online if you wish with others in the book club. Every meeting features 2 Oxford authors in conversation, in this case, the writer of a new book with one of the authors of our backlist titles. Over time, we aim to share histories from across the globe, from a variety of periods of history and many different authorial perspectives. So let's get to the main event, since those of you attending no doubt want to virtually travel to Greenland, Newfoundland, Iceland, and other Viking lands. This is going to be a geographically wide-ranging conversation about Europeans in North America, including the United States and Canada, and large islands in the North Atlantic. It's occurring between 2 authors currently located in Great Britain who have multiple pan-Atlantic nationalities. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our book and authors today. This is the most bare-bones description of these historians, since we could easily take more than a half hour just to talk about their accomplishments. Gordon Campbell is a very prolific emeritus professor of Renaissance studies at the University of Leicester. He's the author of works on the Renaissance, a good number of them, which I'm not going to go through all, as well as other books, including the Bible, the story of the King James Version, 1611 to 2011, and The Hermit in the Garden, from Imperial Rome to Ornamental Gnome. He's joined in conversation by Geoffrey Plank, professor of history at the University of East Anglia. He is the author of numerous books, including Atlantic Wars from the 15th Century to the Age of Revolution, which was recently shortlisted for the Wilson History Prize. Gordon and Jeff are going to speak for about 30 or 35 minutes, and then the floor will be open to all of your questions in the audience. You can start putting them in the chat at any time, and my colleague Erin Cox will bring up as many as she can in the second part of the program. You can also go to the @OUP History Twitter feed, and you can comment using the hashtag OUP History Book Club. So, welcome, Gordon and Jeff. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Susan. All right, well, Gordon, let's get right to it. I really like the book, and
good. I liked writing it.
that struck me from the beginning is that you're telling multiple stories at once, and I was really impressed by the way that you did that in a kind of coherent way, but also not a mechanical way. You tell the story of the Norse going into the Atlantic, starting in the late 8th century, and you tell the story of ideas that started to percolate in the 19th century that were, off base about the Norse going farther than they are. And you also talk about the politics of that, the resonance of it, people sort of using the Norse story in a religiously charged or racially charged way to kind of claim the Anglo-Saxon Norse claim over North America, to claim sovereignty over the continent. And then on top of that, you tell the story of archaeology since the mid-20th century, and basically despite all of the noise that you describe about crazy ideas about the Norse, the sort of progress in our understanding of this phenomenon. And I guess what I wanted to start as a question is just, how did you think about organizing this material? When you were sort of outlining the book at the start, how did you think about telling 3 stories at once and telling them in a coherent way?
Well, it's a sort of onion structure, and it's not one that I arrived at easily. It's interesting that you should distinguish 3 narrative lines. The insight behind that distinction is that archaeologists create different narratives from those told by historians, constructed by historians, and both can be distinguished from ethnic narratives, such as the one in which people have believed in a long-lived Norse settlement in what is now the US. In the case of the archaeological narrative, the challenge was that every new discovery and every new synthesis changes the narrative. So I was trying to construct a snapshot of the present state of play, which I did in the central chapters on Iceland, Greenland, Arctic Canada, and the Norse site in Newfoundland, Lanzo Meadows. And around that core of the onion, I placed some of the fake archaeology, the fake artifacts. On the one side, the Vinland map, and on the other side, the Canadian and American runestones. And then the outer layer of the narrative was historical and historiographical, setting evidence which is distinctly thin for a Norse presence against a false manufactured ethnic narrative. It certainly wasn't a structure that came to me easily, because as I worked on the material, I became gradually aware that I was telling more than one story. The book began as a simple thing about the Norse in the North Atlantic, and then became much more complicated than that.
Well, that interests me. So because that was going to be my next question: is where did which of these narratives were you most interested in the beginning? And it's interesting to me to hear that you were interested in what happened in the around the year 1000. That was the question you started with, in a way. Yep. There's a sense of anger, I think, or certainly frustration in the book, and does it come partly because you started with that original?
Well, I had more than one start. I mean, in Canada, I'm half Canadian, and I was living in Canada in the 1960s when the discoveries were being made in Lanzo Meadows, this Norse site on the tip of the northern peninsula in Newfoundland. And at first, no one was certain what it was. It appeared to be 3 longhouses, but there weren't any there weren't any artifacts. And then in the course of the next 3 years, artifacts started being discovered, and it became clear that we had a Norse site in Canada, which seemed an extraordinary thing. So I came to it from that. That's where my interest started years ago. The broader picture, my first academic job was in Denmark. So I was learning I was learning Danish. I was trying to get my mind around Scandinavian history, all of that, and that led me into it. But the complication came when I was in Iceland. And I went round the National Museum of Iceland, which is a fabulous place. And I noticed that there was not a single exhibit on Greenland. And I thought, this is most peculiar. Iceland had a colony in Greenland for 500 years. And I asked an attendant, a pair of attendants that were sitting there, and I said, what about Greenland? And they said, well, what about it? And there was no interest at all. But one of them recalled that 4 or 5 years previously, there'd been an exhibit on Greenlandic clothing. And I thought, this is very odd. And later, indeed, the same day, I walked along to the National Cathedral in Greenland, and in front of it, there's a huge statue of Leif the Lucky, Leif Erikson, Eric the Red's son. And I thought, well, this is funny because he was in Greenland and he was busy discovering America. Why is this here, and why is there no mention in the museum? And I walked around to the back of the statue, and I saw the label that said, a gift of the people of the United States of America. And this was a revelation to me. It became clear that Iceland had no interest in the discoveries, at least by the measure of the contents of the museum, but that Americans did have an interest in this discovery. And I wasn't thinking historically at this point. I was simply marveling at the contrast. And when at a much later stage I was in Greenland, I visited a site that is said to be the farm of Eric the Red, where Leif Erikson was as well. And again, there was a huge statue of Leif, or Leif, whatever you want to call him, Leif, and there are three possible pronunciations. And I wandered over to the statue, and sure enough, it was, I think, the Norwegian Association of Seattle, and the Seattle Norwegian Ladies Choir had come to sing and inaugurate it. So again, the interest had come from America, and I began to suspect that there was another narrative here. There's the narrative of the Norse crossing the Atlantic, but there's also a sense that emerged in principally in the United States, but also in Canada at a certain point, that the ultimate destiny of the Norse was North America, possibly the United States. And I mean, the Norse didn't have any sense of destiny at all. But the manufacturing of that notion began to coalesce in my mind as a separate narrative from the narrative of what the Norse were actually doing.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, reading the book and also listening to you talk. One lesson I get out of this as somebody who tries to write books is that you kind of demonstrate the value of traveling, of actually going to the places that you're studying, and you get the impression in this book that you actually visited every place you mentioned, which I can't believe that's really true. But I wanted to ask you about a couple of the places that you did go to, and I guess I want to start out with Alexandria, Minnesota, and the museum there that's a statue in front of it with a Viking and wings on his helmet, and he has a shield that says Alexandria, America begins here. Yes. Tell that story. What's in the museum, and why is it important?
It's an extraordinary museum. The statue was made for the 1964 World's Fair in New York, where the runestone in the museum was displayed as evidence that Vikings had discovered America. The runestone there, it's called the Kensington runestone, a few miles from Alexandria in deepest Minnesota, a great place. Which was settled originally by Scandinavians, and there's still a Scandinavian presence there, but it's much diluted as America has become, and Minnesota has become much more diverse. So the narratives aren't as strong as they were at the time. But in 1898, a farmer dug up a runestone, a great slab of rock with runic writing on it, and didn't know what it was, and it was seen by various experts. Some of them thought it was fake, some of them weren't so sure, but it had writing on it, and the writing was very interesting. It says 8 Gotlanders from Gotland, the island by Sweden, and 22 Northmen had traveled to a spot a day's journey from here, and they camped on an island. And one day there was a fishing party, and when the fishermen returned, they found 10 of their colleagues red with blood and dead. And it then says AVM, mysterious, and finishes by saying that their ships are 14 days journey away. And then right at the end, it gives a date, 1362. Now, it was a huge sensation. Hence, America started here. It ricocheted in all kinds of directions, and indeed has produced hundreds of books and articles. There's a vast literature on the Kensington Stone. The AVM initials were interpreted probably correctly as Ave Virgo Maria, Ave Maria. So there were Catholics here in 1362, and this stimulated all kinds of confessional interest. The Archbishop in Minneapolis welcomed the discovery that Catholics had first arrived in Minnesota in 1362, and there was great excitement about it. The problem was there were suspicions that it might not be genuine. And this caused a bitter debate. The chief defenders were either locals, often Scandinavians, or people of Scandinavian origin elsewhere that were interested in America having Scandinavian beginnings. In 1958, a Texan, but with the name Erik Volgren, so Scandinavian, published a book demolishing the authenticity of this runestone, and he was excoriated as a traitor to America, and he wasn't welcome in Minnesota. But he proved fairly definitively that it was a fraud, and we don't know who carved it. It could have been the farmer that discovered it. It could have been somebody playing a practical joke on the farmer. Who knows? But what that caused was people to dig in on either side, with academics saying Volgren has proved that it's a fake, and all kinds of local people of Scandinavian origin saying this is ridiculous, it's obviously genuine. There's a more recent book, a terrific book by a man called David Kruger, who relates it to the Dakota War of 1862, and says that it really creates a kind of prehistory to the Dakota War, in which lots of white settlers were slaughtered, and then there was a fierce retribution at the hands of the authorities, the largest mass execution in American history. And what the stone did was create a kind of context to this, of people of Norse origin. They were Norse being slaughtered by Native Americans. It's the Dakota story. It's the Dakota War being presented as a prequel, if you like. So it has all kinds of ramifications. I think the last one I should mention is that whereas Scandinavian Americans are now part of the cultural mainstream, they're no longer hyphenated Americans in their identities. They were certainly marginal, the settlers in the Eastern Dakotas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, in the late 19th century. And they were deemed to be country hicks compared to the East Coast elites, and they were subject to a lot of condescension. And suddenly here was an object that showed priority over those East Coast elites, that long before the East Coast was settled, the Vikings were in Minnesota, and that was a source of immense pride. So that's what makes it interesting. I hugely enjoyed my visit there. I had to be cautious about what I said, because I come to all things skeptically, like you. I'm a historian, and I was in a community of believers, often very nice people. But it was interesting to be there. I felt privileged to be there.
Something that comes through, I mean, in that story, but also generally in the book, is that there are all sorts of different constituencies that have different takes on the misrepresentations of the Norse and whatever the story of the Norse.
Yes.
And that story, it's interesting that the Catholic Church embraces the Kensington runestone. Whereas when you go back to the prehistory of or not the prehistory, but the earlier history of this Norse myth, part of it is anti-Catholic, and part of it is to, isn't it, to kind of somehow replace Christopher Columbus with somebody from Northern Europe, which is sort of eventually going to be the
That's
Protestant
right. I mean, Columbus was introduced into the narrative shortly after the American Revolution, and the colonists were trying to distance themselves from England. And Columbus was terrific. He was from elsewhere, from Southern Europe. It was believed that he came from Genoa. Lots of people still believe that. But he gradually became problematical, because if you're in the business of saying America should be a country for North European Protestants, then you've got Columbus, who is an Italian who worked in Portugal and then was working for Spain, of all people, and a Catholic. People started to edge nervously away from Columbus, and as a result of that, the Vikings were introduced, and not only were they northern, but because of the Reformation later on in Scandinavia, which never really took off in Italy or Spain, it was assumed that the Norse somehow had Protestantism in their genes. It just wasn't quite realized yet until the Reformation. So they became very acceptable indeed. They had all the right background to be a proper American.
Yeah. Okay, I'm kind of moving into the next sort of theme I wanted to talk about. But another thing that comes through in the book is that each national boundary has its own sort of take on the story. It's like you were talking about the Icelanders not being particularly interested in Greenland, and I'd be intrigued whether the Greenlanders care much about Newfoundland. And there's certainly a Canadian take on this, which is different from the U.S. take, because as you show very clearly, that they're specifically U.S. resonances to the story. But it strikes me that one of the strangest of those different jurisdictions is Greenland, because Greenland really has one of the most extraordinary stories about Norse colonization, about contact with indigenous Americans, going over centuries. Why do we know so little? I mean, talking about the general public. Why does the general public not pay attention to the Greenland story? What did you find out going to Greenland, and how does Greenland fit into your whole narrative?
I find the whole issue very interesting. Lots of people don't think of Greenland as part of North America. And when they talk about the discovery of America by Europeans, the first encounters, they leave Greenland out of it. The capital of Greenland is Nuuk, and in the museum there's a wonderfully feisty sign saying it's true that colonists, regard, by which they mean people like me, regard Greenland as European, and it's still administered for the most part by Denmark. But that's not true. We, the Greenlanders, by which they mean the Inuit, speak the same language as our cousins, who at the closest point are only 15 miles from Canada. And we consider ourselves North Americans. We are North Americans. We're part of the same people. So there is an awkwardness there, and there's a sensibility in Greenland that feels wounded by the insistence of Europeans and Americans that they're not part of North America. But there's also a lot of ignorance about Greenland even now. Partly because there's no connections. You can't fly from America to Greenland. The only flights are from Copenhagen and Reykjavik. People tend not to know a lot of the history, and yet the Norse and Inuit farms, for example, became UNESCO World Heritage Sites in 2017. The two colonies in Greenland were established in the late 10th century, and they lasted until the 15th century. So Europeans in Greenland for 5 centuries, that's as long as Europeans have been in what is now the United States, same 5 centuries. It began as settlements by peasant farmers. They weren't warriors. The notion of the Viking as warrior is largely a 19th century invention. So it began as two settlements. But in 1251, it submitted to the Norwegian crown, and they began to pay taxes and tithes and all that kind of thing. They didn't like it particularly. And medieval Greenland had a stone cathedral They celebrated Mass in Latin. A resident bishop. It had 21 parish churches. The one that's still standing at full height had a choir loft, so they were singing there, and all of that. When you turn to discussions about the first church in North America, people say, well, it's San Juan Bautista in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and that's because they don't think Greenland matters. There's also the question of first contact. The site in Newfoundland, which is by any measure very important, was a site. It's got 3 huts, which were probably 3 boat crews, and it was occupied for up to 10 years, depending on how you read the stratigraphy, by about 60 people who were repairing boats there. The Greenland colony had 2,000 to 3,000 people in it for centuries. That's a big difference. And yet the UNESCO claim for the Newfoundland site, Lanceau Meadows, says this is the spot where the encircling of the earth by humanity was first completed. And it's a deeply moving citation, and it's not true. First contact was in Greenland and Arctic Canada, totally ignored by UNESCO. I must write them a sharp note on the subject sometime. And as for contact, there's no evidence on the Lanceau Meadows site of contact with native Canadians, none at all. The site had been occupied by groups earlier, but there's no sign of contact. Whereas there is a very interesting arrowhead in Copenhagen, and it was dug up in Greenland in a cemetery that closed in 1250. So that gives you the latest possible date. And it's made of a material that is mined on the coast of Newfoundland, and the design can be very specifically located to a bay in Newfoundland, and to a specific culture called the Point Revenge culture. Now, how did a Point Revenge arrowhead get into a graveyard in Greenland? Well, the obvious inference is that a Norse Greenlander was in Newfoundland, probably harvesting timber, because there was only driftwood in Greenland, and he either returned with it in his pocket, that's possible, or he returned with it in his skull, and was buried with it. The site wasn't well reported in the excavation report, so we don't know exactly where it came from. But it seems to me far more likely that it was in the body of a Greenlander who died and was buried there. That's the first evidence of contact. It's not something that happens in Newfoundland at all. So Greenland is excluded from the story in all kinds of interesting ways. It's a great place to visit if you can cope with mosquitoes the size of blackbirds, because there are lots of sheep there. So I am, among other things, a promoter of Greenland as a great place to visit.
Well, I'm intrigued by you saying that there wasn't contact in Newfoundland, because now you're really focusing on the archaeology. And one of the strange things about the archaeologists going to Newfoundland is they really do seem to have been led by the Sagas, and it seems that our agenda even now is, to a certain extent, led by the Icelandic sagas, which do suggest that there was contact and fighting between indigenous peoples and the Norse who went in that direction. I'm kind of throwing you, but did you mean to kind of put the sagas aside when you were telling this story?
Almost. There's a nice analogy if you think of Schliemann excavating what he thought was Troy in the late 19th century on the Anatolia, or the eastern coast of Turkey, and he believed that the Iliad was true. and that there was a place called Troy, and it got attacked and it got burnt and all the rest of it. So he went, and with his little shovel, he dug down, and when he got to a layer that we know of as 7A, he found burnt wood, and he said, "Aha, Troy was burnt." And then there were various objects scattered around the site, which he assembled and called them Priam's treasure, and therefore declared the Iliad to be historical. Well, if you believe that, you'd believe anything, and no archaeologist believes that now. The sagas are more recent, but they're not logbooks, and they're often read as if they're logbooks. People try and use the directions in them in a much more specific way than can be done. The logbooks are not stories of exploration; they're family histories. And Eric the Red was deemed to be the ancestor of people for whom the sagas were written. So it becomes, and he may or may not have existed. It could have been a chieftain called Eric. He could have had a son called Life, though I begin to doubt it. He could have had a family, those sons and his wife who converted to Christianity, but there's not the slightest shred of evidence that they existed. If you think of all the findings of objects in Greenland with names on them, not one of the names in the sagas ever comes up. There's a complete gap. So I'm on the skeptical side of the sagas. They are recalling things, and they're as accurate as stories that you've heard about your great grandfather, or the catalogue of ships in Iliad 2. I mean, I don't expect to find the remains of any of those ships. So it seems to me that reading the sagas as historical narratives creates a kind of fictional account that I'm very hesitant about buying into. Having said that, we've talked about archaeological scholars and historical scholars, but literary scholars are sometimes inclined to say, well, there must be truth in this, if only we can sort out the truth from the one-legged bowmen that shoot at people, all of that, but we can find real history in there. I'm afraid I don't believe it for a minute.
Okay. All right. I want to move on to a different theme now, just basically about the political resonance, or the sort of the kind of the dark side of the story you're telling. You've already mentioned it in connection with the Kensington runestone. It seemed clear to me reading through the book that there's a way in which this creates a kind of racially charged vision of American history, especially in the U.S. But actually, there was something in the book that jumped out at me, because it wasn't really about retrospective justification of an old genocidal policy, but something prospective. It's when you talked about immigration restriction in 1924. Do you think that that this Norse discovery of America that people had in their heads actually did help inform immigration restriction in the 1920s?
I fear so. 1924 is the Johnson-Reed Act, which restricted migration from Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and it set limits, 4,000 for Italy, as I recall, on Southern Europe, and limits on countries with significant Jewish populations. The next year, President Coolidge declared Life the Lucky to be the discoverer of America. And putting those two together is quite interesting. This is a vision of America as a country for white Protestants. And the story of the Norse in America, both the true bits that the Norse did cross the Atlantic, and the fake bits that they had established a colony in America. And you've got a vision of America as a country for white Protestants that marginalizes both indigenous Americans and colonists, or people who've emigrated there from anywhere else. If you add to that American exceptionalism, which derives, of course, from British exceptionalism. We're just as guilty. Then you end up displacing the native people. And the myth of North America, the part of the potency of it is that it supports that vision of an America in which white Protestants are in charge, and it's one that still persists to this day.
Yeah. Something that you just said sort of scares me a little. I'm not blaming you for this, but you said that there's sort of a political implication or a political resonance to the true bits as well as to the mythology.
Yes,
and that's I don't really know how to deal with that. I started my last book talking about the Norse and the North Atlantic, and I know that there's some people who think this is a kind of a dodgy topic because it's been deployed in not very nice political ways.
yes.
And so how should we negotiate that? I mean,
Well, it's certainly the case that historians, scholars in general, who engage with the public rather than each other, and many just engage with each other, receive lots of abuse if they explore hot button subjects. But your point is rather more subtle. I suppose it's clearest in Canada, where an interest in exploring Norse history in Canada, rather than First Nations history, for example, can be seen as an endorsement of colonialism. It can be seen as having well, very bluntly, a racist edge to it, and that can easily make people nervous and make people reticent. It's something that I mean, I've written on controversial subjects before, but it's something as I started on this subject to wonder about. There is nervousness, and that's why there was a little gap that I could fill with this book, that I was willing to receive the hate mail that inevitably follows from exploring this kind of thing. But it's something I think we do have obligations to do. We do talk to each other as historians, but we must also talk to at least that section of the public that read books. They're an important class of influencers, at least when book readers hold political power. It's true that television has more influence and social media has much more influence, but for detailed argument, you need books, and like those that you and I write, and we are addressing book readers, and we hope that they are opinion formers, and in a sense that's all we can do. But if you're saying that occasionally subjects like this make us nervous, then yes, I think probably so.
Right. Okay. Yeah. You talked a little bit about who you imagine your readers to be, and yeah, I guess this is sort of the last question I've got. But do you imagine? I mean, and I think it could be that some people who believe in the Kensington runestone would read your book and get convinced. I mean, there are points in your book where you sort of say, well, you'll never get convinced people, if they really believe this mythology.
Yep.
Do you think that you might break through?
I doubt it. If we go back to the book on the Kensington runestone,
right? Yeah.
Non-believers remain non-believers, and if you don't believe there was a moon landing, there's nothing that's going to change your mind. We can't address people like that. What we can do is, as writers, is be courteous, always, and to try and appeal to the better instincts of people. I did a book a few years ago, as was mentioned, on the King James Bible, and I referred to the Mormons as an important branch of the Christian faith. And it had the most extraordinary results. I got a few abusive emails saying Mormons are not Christians, go soak your head. But I got many friendly notes from Mormons who were just grateful for that single line. And for me, it was just a courtesy. I think the Mormons are an important branch of the Christian faith, and they have a take on the Bible. So I've tried in this book as well to be above all courteous to people with whom I disagree, in the hope, sometimes vain, sometimes realized, that they will be courteous in return.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'll introduce myself to the audience. I'm Erin Cox here at Oxford University Press, and I'm going to ask some questions from the audience. Some questions to you, but the conversation has been so fascinating. So I'm sure everybody has been as riveted as I have been. I guess the first question, and you sort of alluded to it, is what kind of criticism have you received from readers? Has anybody sent nasty notes?
Oh yes.
Oh
Of
yes.
course they have. And they don't show signs of having read the book awfully closely or at all. You could look on Amazon. You'll see some deeply hostile ones saying, "Why doesn't the man know about Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland?" And I mentioned it on the first page in the preface, and there's a chapter on it, so they haven't got very far. But the correspondence has been very interesting in that some of it that is critical is deeply reasoned, but there's also a sense that Brits don't have a right to talk about America. And that has an exact parallel in Britain. There are British historians who think that Americans really don't understand Britain and shouldn't be writing about Britain. Both are complete nonsense. We can all write and study whatever we like. And so there's some of that. But also some people simply ask questions about specific artifacts and what my view is on them, and have I actually seen them. And that's good as well. The correspondence is on the whole friendly, but sometimes abusive and occasionally obscene. But that's all right. I don't mind.
But it sounds like you're almost doing what Jeff suggests, which is that you might be getting through to people if they're asking follow-up questions and wanting to know more information.
And I find that very satisfying. I still get questions on books that I wrote 15 years ago.
Oh wow!
And I think that's nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And OUP keeps them in print electronically.
Yes, we do. A question from the audience: do you have a favorite fake artifact and why?
Gosh, I do. It's called the Beardmore Relic. It's actually should be relics plural. It's in the Royal Ontario Museum. So I knew it as a child, and it was a Viking find in northern Ontario. It's a sword and an axe head. It's real. It's 11th century.
Wow.
And I was very taken with it as a child. I have another friend who lives in the States, in Washington, also Canadian, and he decided to become a museum specialist on the strength of this. But although the artifacts are real, the story behind them is rather more problematical. It was a prospector in northern Ontario. He had rented a house from a bloke, a Norwegian guy, and in the basement of the house there was this sword and axe head. But it's a case of talking too much in the bar after a few pints. And he said, yes, he'd found it when he was out prospecting, and he blasted away some trees, and there it was on the ground, and the rust mark was still there. And the problem was the story, having told the story, it kept growing, and eventually it came to the attention of the museum, the Royal Ontario Museum, who offered to buy it from the relics from him. So he sold them the relics, $500, and a lot of money for him.
Yeah.
And gradually questions started being asked. And eventually it turned out that it was a hoax. The weapons, the father of the guy who owned the house it was a well-known Norwegian collector of medieval Norse weapons. And his son had emigrated to Canada, and he had a couple of pieces from his father's collection, and that's where it came from. So
Wow.
it was withdrawn from the Royal Ontario Museum. But it's now, when I was there a few years ago, I went to see it, and it's in the medieval weapons display, and it's not labeled. There's nothing about Beardmore. There's nothing about the discovery. It's just there as an example of 10th century Norse weaponry. So I'm attached to it, not because it's the best, but because it's one that I've had with me all my long life.
That's fun. That's fun. And what a great story too.
It is. It's a wonderful story.
Another question from the audience. Do you attribute some of the interest in North Americans finding their Norse heritage to the increased use in genetic testing like 23andMe?
Yes, the genetic testing is an interesting component for all of this. I mean, one of the things that interests me as someone who clearly has a Scottish background, Gordon Campbell, is that the genetic testing of Icelanders whose families go back to the settlement period show that the mitochondrial DNA, the woman's DNA, 40% of Icelanders have Celtic. Icelandic people women have Celtic DNA from Scotland and Ireland, which were part of the Viking kingdom. So the Norse were clearly, Norse men were picking up Norse women either as wives or as slaves, and they were taking them to Iceland. So the people in Iceland and Greenland, the people that may have got close to North America, that went to Newfoundland, were not purely Norse. The reason they look purely Norse in the sagas is that the sagas are written for the Norse. It's not because they were purely Norse. So you have a notion not of a pure stream at all from which people claim to be descended, but a deeply mixed scheme. The one thing that amused me, my surname is Campbell, and off I went into the National Museum in Nuke, and there's a little shield there. It's 13th century, and it has it's made of silver. It was carved on the spot, and it's the Campbell coat of arms. So there was a Campbell there in Greenland. What he or she was doing there, I haven't the faintest idea. The Campbells weren't a seafaring lot. And he disappears. So my theory is he went off and discovered America. So the same thing happens with the various tests that you can now take to establish your ancestry. When one was taken in Britain at the Viking Center, Jorvik in York, one of my colleagues in genetics, the woman who identified the bones of Richard III correctly, she conducted a little survey and discovered a huge proportion of people want to be descended from the Vikings. So it's a desirable outcome. Now, that's on one level entirely harmless, but on another level, it's all about wanting to be super white. And the same is true, that same kind of appetite to be super white can exist in America as it does in Britain. And that has a deeply sinister side to it that I'm alert to, that we're all alert to. It dispossesses people with darker skins. And in the 21st century, that's not acceptable.
Yeah. Well, also, I wonder if some of it is not only the sort of super white aspect of it, but also the conquerors and Vikings. Vikings are cool, right? You know?
Oh yeah, no, they are. They're winners, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, I watched that show, Vikings. I mean, they're pretty tough. They're pretty cool.
Yep.
Even the ladies, you know.
I mean, they're in many ways invented. the horns, for example, on the helmets. I mean, if real Vikings had horns, then enemies could grab them and
Right.
or could knock them off in the head with it. They were invented in the late 19th century in the dressing rooms of Wagner operas.
Right.
That's where they come from. So there's a brilliant American writer who died recently, Annette Kolodny, talking about the importance of being first.
Right.
She's a terrific historian, and she talks about the emergence of the plastic Viking as the discoverer of America. It's a terrific book. But you're right. Vikings are not deemed to be wicked people. But when you look at them, even in the sagas, Eric the Red is a serial killer. There's no other way to describe it. He kills people everywhere and gets banished, and that's how he ends up in Greenland. Well, that's not the sort of person I think that one should mix with in polite company.
Right.
Nor does one want to be descended from him. But that's all blotted out when people seek Viking ancestry.
Right. Well, we only want to take the good, not the bad.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Another question from the audience. Can you talk about the decision to incorporate all the primary texts in foreign languages?
In the book?
In the book.
Well, I translate myself as a matter of principle. If you only read translations, you are the captive of the translator. And I speak as one who often translates from various languages. So if my publisher will allow me, and Oxford is very tolerant on this one, I always print the originals, even if it's in a funny script, as it is in other work that I've been doing. And then translate. So you're after two kinds of people, I suppose, in doing this. I expect people to read my translation, and then those that have the appropriate language can look at what I'm translating from, and can make their own judgment. And sometimes they do. I make mistakes. We all make mistakes. It's not as original. The Old Norse that I quote is not as original as it might seem. In the first draft of the book, I used a collection of Norse sagas that has Icelandic spelling. And one of the press readers told me off for that. I should use Old Norse spelling. So I penitent. I went back and I used standardized Old Norse. But standardized Old Norse is an invention of the late 19th century, because Old Norse is really a vast collection of different ways of writing things. Academics need a standard way of representing it, so they invented one. So the same is true. I mean, I quote Latin and translate Latin in the book. 15th century Latin is not written the same way as the Latin we may or may not have written in school. So I standardize Latin. So in part, it's an illusion in that I'm working with standardized versions of languages, but in part, it's a service to the reader, and it's a plea for authenticity. Mm-hmm. That I do read things in the original languages as a matter of deeply embedded principle. But writing is not a matter of exhibitionism. If you just quote in a foreign language and don't translate, you're showing off. That I don't want to do that. I think writing is an act of communication rather than an act of exhibition.
I love that. Another question from the audience. Do female characters play any role in the founding myth?
That's a very shrewd question. They certainly play a role in the sagas. If nothing else, the Christianity is introduced by women, but they are written out of the notion of the Viking, the 19th century notion of the Viking. The Viking is male, And one of the 19th century writers, Thomas Carlyle, a great sage, said that the British, who were essentially a female race, had to be be impregnated with the male race of the Norse, and therefore the modern Brit, the modern American, is an amalgam of Norse male and British female. Now, I recognize nonsense when I see it, but it's immensely influential nonsense. And indeed, the Norse are portrayed as conquerors and conquering often virgin territory. And that is a gender-loaded language that makes females the object of conquest and males being the conquerors. So women are there, but in ways that that make me uncomfortable and make us all uncomfortable. But it's part of the gendering of history, which historians are now quite rightly trying to unpick, because these representations are not helpful to anybody.
Yeah, for sure. We have one last question.
Yep.
So this is a topic in which there are many people with niche interests who are not trained academics.
Yep.
How did you manage the range of sources to write this book?
Well,
Jeff's laughing.
Yes. I decided in the first instance to write the book for your trade division rather than your academic division.
Yes.
And that means, the way I operate, two things. It means no footnotes, which means you can get away with generalizations that if you write for academic, you can't. But the other things it means is a controlled vocabulary. And I do control the vocabulary, and my brutal editors at OUP control my vocabulary as well. So the language has to be communicable to the general reading public, which is an audience that does exist. I've come to believe in its existence over the years. When it comes to sources, it's a case of fairly long explanations of what constitutes a source and an evaluation of the relative value of the source. It can be complicated, but the way I tend to deal with it is to try and turn it into a narrative. So dealing with something as complex as the Vinland map, for example, which is a problematical manuscript in all kinds of ways. It has a deeply complex history. And I dealt with it by turning it into a story. Let me tell you the story of the Vinland map. And the science and the history, the chemistry, the belief, the mistakes all feed into something that is a narrative. Whereas if I were writing, or Jeff were writing for an academic journal, we wouldn't use the narrative format because it's a different kind of audience. You're talking to fellow academics who are interested in the presentation and analysis of evidence, and that's very different from telling a story that you're communicating to the general public.
Yeah. Well, for everyone who's watching, who, whether they are academics or lay readers, I think we all appreciated that it was a great book and great story. And that is the end of our discussion. But I'd like each of you to, if you have any last words that you want to share with our audience, that I'll give you that opportunity. Do you have any last things, Gordon? What do you hope people will take away from the book?
I always hope with my books that people will learn a little bit and will doubt a little bit. And I try to leave things open to the intelligence of the reader. And OUP books have a lot of intelligent readers out there. So ultimately, I'd like people to think a little bit. And just as writing the book made me think quite a lot, so I'm eager to pass something of that process on to the reader. Jeff?
Well, I just wanted to, picking up on what you were saying about storytelling, it's hugely entertaining, this book. And so I would tell people to pick it up, because you tell all these stories as sort of detective stories. You're trying to get to the bottom of the hoax or whatever. And it is great fun. The stories are great fun. So I just encourage people to pick it up, because it's a good read.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just dropped the link in the chat for anybody who wants to go check out the book on our website. And thank you, gentlemen. This was such a great conversation, really interesting. And I'm intrigued to hear what other response you get from readers, Gordon, because it'll be interesting to see if people stop sort of promoting that myth in the way that they do. We'll see. And I just want to, for everybody who's watching, I just want to share, we have our next OUP History Book Club on September 9th, and that is with Carter Malkasian and Geoffrey Engel, talking about Carter's book, The American War in Afghanistan, A History, which is very timely as everything that's going on in the news. At any rate, Gordon, Jeff, thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation. I hope you had fun. It seemed like you were having a great time. We had a great time watching you, and thank you very much.
And thanks to you. Thanks to you, Jeff.
Yeah.